So if you didn't know who the Identitarians are, they look sort of like this. They are very prominent with their black and yellow, with their lambda symbol. That's the Greek symbol of lambda. They took that from the comics, well, from the movie 1300, if you know it, the very fictionalized movie about the Spartans and how they, 300 of them, had this fight against the Persians. So they see themselves as sort of these 300s defending Europe. Defending Europe is their key slogan. I will talk about that later. And most importantly, they have very prominent action on the streets, in the mountains, on the sea, and they always, and the pictures you see above are propaganda pictures. They're taken by themselves, putting it on social media and wanting some sort of reaction out of it. And they were founded in 2012 in France, so it's 10 years, as Génération Identitaire. And from France, they spread all over Europe. But they gained prominence in 2015-16 because then they found their campaigning, and it was against refugees. So they would travel to the borders of Europe with there's no way, posters, make pictures, and presenting themselves as the defenders of Europe, even chartered a ship on the Mediterranean, that's what we see here, and trying to push refugee boats back. In the end, they got into trouble and they had to be rescued by the Italian Coast Guard, but that's just a side note, but it's sort of what you think you are and how reality works not always come together. But especially the chartering the ship on the Mediterranean, that's how they gained immense prominence in the Anglo-Saxon discourse, and that's how they formed strong bonds with the alt-right in the US. So, and with that, I presented their most important arenas where they make their action. It's on the streets and on social media. And these two go together, and it's not either or, so they have some sort of banner drop or whatever, and they would put pictures on immediately and have an audience that's much larger than what we did know of right-wing extremist groups until then. Because the new thing they introduced is that they work transnational. So they see all of Europe as their cultural sphere that needs to be defended. And until then, we had right-wing groups that were very focused on national spaces. So Germany, Austria, Italy, and so on. And of course, the language barriers were always that they would have their action very locally. With the Identitarians, we have a right-wing neo-fascist group that would see the whole of Europe as their public. We saw they were founded in France. It's 10 years, almost to the day. It was October 2012 in France. And Austria and Germany soon became centers. So we have France, Germany, and Austria as the most important identitarian groups, and they sort of pushed the other groups, but we also had groups in the Scandinavian countries, in Slovenia, in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in the UK later on, so they sort of popped up. But the most important legacy is that they showed new ways of doing fascism, of doing right-wing extremism. And that changed how right-wing extremism worked. Even if it's not the Identitarians anymore, I will come to that part later, they shaped on how you actually do it. And that's what we see on the streets even now. The Identitarians, and I will really just swish through that part, are part of the new right. So just to provide a bit of context, if we want to talk about the new right, we will have to talk about the conservative revolution going back 100 years, just to show that it's not so new what they actually do. Because in the 1920s, when we say fascism, we always associate it with National Socialism, of course. But there was not one fascist ideology, there were many fascist ideologies. And they were even in, they fought with each other, they were not, they had no consensus on a few things, so they didn't like each other and so on. So one of these groups, it's more of a loose network of fascist and extreme right intellectuals in the 1920s in the Weimar Republic in Germany. They fought or they thought they fought an intellectual warfare. So they didn't want to be on the streets, they were not the SR, they weren't the SS, but they were writers, authors, intellectuals, scholars even. And they would write against parliamentarism, the republic, democracy. Most prominent figures, Oswald Spengler, Ernst Jünger, Carl Schmitt, Edgar Julius Jung, Arthur Müller-van den Broek are probably the most prominent names, but it would be too easy to simply call them Nazis, because many of them had a complicated relationship with National Socialism. If you take, for example, Edgar Julius Jung, he was murdered by the SS. So you cannot just call him a Nazi, but still he was a fascist. People like Carl Schmitt, of course, made a career inside the NS state. So it's complicated, but you see there are different kinds of fascism existing parallel and next to each other, even in the Weimar Republic in Germany. And the same thing, we jump in time after the Second World War. It was very complicated to call yourself Nazi in France. So they didn't trace themselves back to the Nazis, but to the conservative revolution, and called themselves the Nouvelle Droite, the new right, die neue Rechte. And they also changed on where they wanted to act, because they saw in France in the 50s and 60s, if you want to form a right-wing party, most likely you will not get into parliament. So they didn't focus on forming parties and getting into parliament, but they wanted to change the public discourse. They wanted to change the minds of the people. And so they withdrew from party politics and formed think tanks, newspapers, and so on. And with that comes a new strategy on where right wings act. And that's what they took from, they copied from the conservative revolution. And the most important arena is the pre-political space. So they read Antonio Gramsci, they knew about cultural hegemony, and tried to shift the public to the right. And that's what they have been doing for the past decades, with varying degrees of success, but they see themselves as warriors. They see themselves as engaging in some kind of cultural, intellectual warfare. And this is the context on where to put the Identitarians. And now we have, I mean, this was mostly old white men writing newspaper articles and having some sort of debate and providing debate stages. But now we have the Identitarians coming in 2012. Of course, there were other groups before, groups like Casa Pound. But the Identitarians provided a sort of template for all of Europe on how you can bring this intellectual, cultural warfare onto the streets. And I will show you on how So that's not. So this is the video that started it, and it went viral. It got subtitles in all the different languages, and it was the most important point of reference on how a modern transnational European fascism could look like. And there are many aspects in this video. It's very professionally made. It gets more and more dramatic in how they speak, in the music, so it's very much a propaganda video. But what they talk about is, and also they show their faces. That was something very new to right-wing extremism, so to present yourself as somebody not with masks and not hidden behind something, but to present yourself as somebody actually belonging to a right-wing group. But the topics are still the most important topics. You have economic decline, you have all this unemployment, debt, and so on, and you mix it with cultural topics, with racism, with misogyny, with anti-feminism. It's not political correctness anymore, but now it's anti-woke or whatever, but how you do it, it stays the same. So you mix it and you say, well, there's decadence, always important for fascism to talk about decadence and how it's all in decline, especially cultural decline, and they are the answer to that. So they are not going to do the same as the generations before them. Also very important, they present themselves as the youth of Europe. I try not to move as much. They present themselves as the youth of Europe, so the youth of Europe awakens and does away with the past, because the past, the generations before them, they slid it into decadence, and now there's a rebirth of Europe, and they will be the ones to bring Europe into a new golden age. So these are fascist topics. So you have the palingenetics, or the rebirth of a nation, of a culture, very deeply rooted with it. And of course, they put the aspect of youth at the forefront of it, because they present themselves as the youth. And that was entirely new to the extreme right as we knew it in Europe, especially because in the last 10 years, it was youth was important. They mixed it with pop culture. Pop culture was something the extreme right wouldn't touch, because they would say it's, well, US and we don't want it. But they wouldn't present themselves as the neo-Nazi groups, not with runes and Thor's hammer and so on, but they would a very modern look, and especially hard to get that it's something right-wing, because if you don't know it, it looks like any other poster or sticker or whatever. They have direct street action. That's something they actually took from neo-Nazi groups. The new right wouldn't do that, because they wanted to do intellectual warfare, and now we have the combination of intellectual warfare and actual street action, and of course transnationalism. They wouldn't just say, well, we're here to defend Austria or whatever, but Europe as a cultural sphere. And why Europe? Because Europe is threatened, and the aspect of threat is important. The threat comes from within, diversity, feminism, anti-racism, and so on. But also the threat comes from the outside. And from the outside, with 2015-16, it was clear, refugees. And they wouldn't call those people refugees, but they would call them soldiers. People coming here trying to fight a war. And we are defending Europe, so we are acting in self-defense, so it's a righteous fight against soldiers from the enemy. Culture is the key aspect. They are creating a European culture. The generational conflict with presenting themselves as the youth defending Europe. Of course, there's this aspect of ethno-pluralism, at least within Europe, which is interesting because especially in the German-speaking world, in the 1920s and 30s, fascism defined itself very much of being anti-Slavic, so being against Eastern Europeans. And now, 100 years later, they present themselves as belonging to the same culture and having to defend Europe together. And of course, the great threat that comes from within and from the outside is the Great Replacement. Because fascism always works on having yourself, your identity, your culture threatened and having to defend itself. And by having to defend itself, it's either you or the others. And so you have to do away with the others. This sort of identity is, in the end, it's a völkisch identity. So it's based that you belong to a certain place and have your roots in that place. It's static, you cannot change it, and it will not change over time. So you always belong to, you're rooted in this place, and you cannot give it away. It's a collective, singular and collective. I just wanted to write collective, sorry. It's a collective identity, so you share your völkisch identity with all those belonging to the folk, to the nation, to the culture, but you cannot become part of the folk or of culture. It's something that's static, it's not inclusive. You're either born within culture, within folk, within the nation, or you're not. And if you're not part of it, then you have to go away, because the culture, the folk, the nation has to stay pure. And it's always threatened. It's always threatened by people who are not us. It's us and them. And it's threatened by, and that's the lasting legacy of the Identitarians, and I will come to an end with that, is the Great Replacement Theory. Great Replacement Theory, Le Grand Remplacement, was actually invented in France by Renaud Camus. In 2011, he wrote a book called The Great Replacement. The Identitarians took that book and made a campaign out of it. And with 2015-16, it became the slogan of anti-refugee protests. It was translated into German in 2016 with the title Revolte gegen den großen Austausch, Revolt against the Great Replacement, so a call to action. And that's what they did. And ever since then, the idea that you have to stand up against being replaced is very, very prominent, or the most prominent idea within right-wing extremism, not just in Europe, but also in the US. In New Zealand, the terrorist of Christchurch, he called his manifesto the Great Replacement. This year, the terrorist in Buffalo also had in his manifesto Great Replacement Theory. Hanau, Halle, everybody refers to having to do something against the Great Replacement. The idea of Great Replacement is, it's a conspiracy theory, basically. So the idea is Europe is weak, and it's weakened from within by feminists, by all this diversity, anti-racist, multicultural, and so on thing. But there are also these globalists. The globalists are a group of people who work in the shadows. You can see it's very closely connected to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories from 100 years ago. And these globalists threaten to replace the indigenous people of Europe. And the indigenous people of Europe are, of course, white people. And everybody, so white people belong to Europe, and everybody who is not white doesn't belong here. And so it's a war against European identity, and they are acting in self-defense. And that's why when you read the manifesto of the Christchurch terrorist, he will present himself as somebody who didn't start the war, but who's prepared to fight it. So it's always they started it, and we're just trying to defend ourselves. Of course, it's a conspiracy theory, and it's no wonder that something like the Great Replacement became so important in times like this, because conspiracy theories always emerge in times of crisis. Because with conspiracy theories, you can regain control, you have coherency, you understand what's going on, and it all makes sense all of a sudden, and it provides heroism. You are the hero of your own story. You're not just some small person in the tides of the world, but you are a hero and you can change the world. So what comes next? I told you the Identitarians as a group are not that important anymore. They're on the decline, but they left us with this huge legacy that changed how neo-fascism, how right-wing extremism actually works. We have new organizations, we have new alliances. It becomes very unclear on what actually is political organization, what is just spontaneous alliances on the street. We saw it with the Corona protests, but the ideology of the Identitarians is still present, especially with the Great Replacement theory. And authoritarianism, as well as in the next steps, right-wing extremism and fascism. We always also have to talk about fascism. They are crisis solutions. So in the times of huge crisis, these actors will always try to gain control of a broader narrative. And they start, as the Identitarians showed, with young people. And what the future holds, unclear. We see a lot of escalation strategies within right-wing extremism. They try to, they're prone to more violence, more terrorist attacks. The language gets more and more and more violent, even genocidal. And this is especially bad news, and I wish I could end on a better, and with a better outlook, but it's especially bad news if we look at the climate crisis. Because the climate crisis, as we all know, is the big crisis and bigger as everything we have known before. And now, the major right-wing extremist actors, they deny it even exists. But they will very soon switch from denying to actually accepting it. And accepting it in authoritarian terms by saying it's actually good what happens, because a lot of people will die, but it will not be white people. So they will accept, and they will actually try to bring authoritarian fascist solution by promoting genocide. And I really wish I could end on better terms, but it's really, really, it's so serious. I really try to warn you. It's so serious at the moment. And if you look on how these actors move, on how they form alliances, on what ideology they provide, and how fast it works by clinking together worldwide, we really, really have to see that, to analyze that, and to react to it. Because right-wing extremism and even fascism is a real, real threat to this society. And I hope when we talk, we can find solutions and end on a lighter note. Thank you.